World War I began in Europe in 1914 and lasted until 1918. The major nations involved were colonial powers, and the fighting spread from Europe across the globe. It is estimated that 2 million German sons, brothers, and fathers died fighting by the end of the war in 1918. How did this happen? Why did so many common people support the war for so long? By the end of the war, the German Navy had revolted, forcing the German emperor off of his throne in favor of a republic. Today, it's difficult to imagine so many people supporting such a deadly war for so long. The German government was supported by an enthusiastic nationalist propaganda machine. Today, we wonder if a picture has been photoshopped. We assume many of them are staged. World War I took place before news apps or even nightly TV news. Images in newspapers were rare. They couldn't be instantly uploaded, and waiting for photos to come from the front lines meant the news would be old. Images that were included in newspapers and posters were typically drawings or sketches.
Because they were created far from the front lines, what was published reflected the views of artists or the publisher. In August 1914, Kaiser William II of Germany declared that his nation was at war. That month, Paul Cassier Verlag began publishing Kriegszeit Kunstlerflugblatter, the wartime's artist flyer. It was a weekly 4-page broadsheet of German nationalist posters with contributions from a variety of artists. The first page of the first edition shows a crowd of people assembled outside of a government building to hear the declaration of war. The name of the poster is "I No Longer Know of Factions," representing the unity of German people in spite of their differing socio-economic status. As soon as the war began, propaganda began to support it. Propaganda was distributed in cities and in the countryside. Nationalist supporters of the war published posters like this one that were displayed on carts and trucks, in shop windows, and hung from buildings. These works united the people behind the goals of Kaiser. Just a week later, the second edition included a picture called "Messenger of Victory" on the public clock. In it, a man sits on a clock in the town center reading news of a German victory in the opening days of war. This drawing, published on September 7th, likely shows news of easy early victories of the German army as it moved through Belgium into France. After decades of peace in Europe, most people only knew of military battles in colonized countries. The first news of war, delivered in town squares like this poster shows, reinforced the idea that German forces were superior and a European war would be no more disruptive than a colonial one.
In the 6th edition of the paper, German bravery and invincibility is shown in mythological terms. Titled "Hercules Hindenburg Slays the Russian Bear," it shows German General Hindenburg as the Greek god Hercules, and he's stabbing a bear that's slightly shorter than he is. The Russian Empire was one of the Allied powers in the war, battling Germany and the Central Powers. Russia was commonly depicted in art as a bear. Even though Russia had a much larger landmass than Germany, the bear is drawn smaller than a German man. Consumers of this propaganda would also understand that the legendary strength and invincibility of Hercules had transferred to the German military and people. In October 1914, one of the few pictures appeared that was solemn in nature. Fear shows a German woman, alone, dark, and apprehensive. Audiences in the early 1900s expected public artists to make work that supported the government and nation, but neither public sentiment nor government censorship prevented the publisher from printing pieces that showed the anxieties of war. Sources like the Kriegszeit were the main way the public learned what life on the front line was like. The issue of Christmas Eve 1914 shows a sketch called "After the Distribution of Christmas Presents." German troops are reading letters from home, one is smoking a pipe. Posters like this reassured the German public that their loved ones were receiving letters and gifts, had leisure time, and were in good health. Art like this also made war seem less threatening for German men and boys who would soon be called to fight.
In January 1915, the 24th edition of the paper was published. The cover art shows a sea lion having trouble swallowing a fish that is partially in its mouth. Great Britain was another of the Allied powers fighting Germany. In its own propaganda, Britain was shown as a lion. This piece is called "The British Lion in Embarrassment." Showing Britain as a sea lion, a trained circus animal, instead of the king of the beasts, is a way of mocking the enemy. It shows the most powerful country in the world having bitten off more than it can chew. German viewers would understand that their nation wasn't going to be swallowed by the British Empire. A few weeks later, the paper revisits the British involvement in the war. This time it depicts Germany as an animal. the German military are eagles flying over the English Channel to England. At this point in the war, fighting was raging across the continent, but the German homeland had not been substantially invaded. By taking the fight to the enemy, the German people were reassured that they were safe in their homes and their government would protect them.
The Ottoman Empire fought alongside Germany as a central power in the war. The Muslim Ottomans were represented by a crescent. Issue 34 of the paper came out in April of 1915. The cover is titled The Dardanelles. The Dardanelles are an island chain off the coast of Greece where a series of battles were fought for over a year. The British sea lion is shown impaled on a crescent representing the Ottoman Empire. In addition to drawing blood from the enemy, this poster reassures the German people that they were not fighting alone in this war.
Later that same month, the artists turned their attention to the homeland. War Sewing Room shows German women united, producing cloth goods for the war effort. This would remind civilians that their war effort was important too. Domestic production of goods is vital in war when supply lines are disrupted, and this sketch reinforces the idea that the nation is united as one, everyone working together for the German good. In May 1915, a poster was included with the title, Hooray for the U-5. It celebrates the launch of a new ship in the German Navy. It's a show of the advancing technology of the German Empire. It's also the last issue of the Kriegszeit included in the Nabb Center archives.
We know that as the war dragged on, the posters began to be more ambiguous and less optimistic. The Kriegszeit stopped publishing on March 1916. The publisher directed his efforts to a new periodical that was far less warlike and more pacifist. As the war dragged on and more Germans died, propaganda outlets stopped supporting the Kaiser. As the propaganda stopped and suffering increased, public support for the war withered. Ultimately, this withdrawal of public support led to military mutiny and a civilian revolution. A newly installed Republican government negotiated the end of Germany's involvement in World War I. As the posters from the Kriegszeit Kunstlerflugblatter show, propaganda helps us to understand some of the ways that governments maintain their authority and public support in the face of massive military losses in the World War I. And it can help us view our media today through a more critical lens and wonder what we're being led to support in spite of the facts.